Hello, and welcome to the third week of Theological Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Now we're going to start talking about Israel, which, as you might have picked up at this point, is an extraordinarily important part of the Bible. In fact, as we talk about using this narrative method or approach of interpreting the Bible, we need to understand that Israel, and we've talked about this before, is itself, as a people, a character in the biblical story. It is a character in the unfolding of cosmic and salvation history. And so, understanding Israel's place in not only the Jewish tradition, but in the Christian tradition is extraordinarily important for understanding what the Judeo-Christian tradition is actually saying about the world. And so we will start with this very foundational concept, which is called covenant. All right? But before we do that, let's get into, I don't know why that happened. What is going on here? Sorry about that. All right, so before we get into that, let's start with some review, okay? So I think we've already kind of covered the Bible as story. We're reading the Bible as an unfolding of salvation history that begins with God and creation, and as we will get to, ends with God's restoration of creation. And so let's remember those 8 great acts of the biblical story, which I want you to know. So, creation, fall, covenant or calling, kingdom, exile, redemption, reestablishment, and finally restoration. Okay, so that is the 8 great acts of the biblical story. Now, of course, as you recall, hopefully, there's different ways to understand the acts. These are the way I'm teaching it for this class. Some people use 4 or 5 or 3, and those are all fine too, but this is the way we're going to approach it. And so, as you know, we're now into the 3rd act, which is the covenant. And so the story of Israel, in its most basic sense, is three of these acts. That's covenant, kingdom, and exile. So that's where we're at right now. We're starting with covenant. And the covenant is about God's solution. All right, so where we left off with the fall was, we're in a bad way. The world is falling apart because of sin, because humans are not only not acting in line with the intention of the Creator, but are actively rebelling against it. We are assaulting the intention of the Creator. We are in opposition to the intention of the Creator. Hata, in this case, the Hebrew word for sin, to miss the mark, is, as we talked about, not just the idea that we are missing the target, because remember it's an archery term, but rather, not only missing the target, we're turning around and trying to shoot our archery teacher. So it's very important that we understand this is not just a passive sort of fall or missing the mark, it's an active one. And so, seeing this unfold through Genesis 1 through 11, the effects of the fall, Genesis 12 is going to be a shift in the story. And that shift is the calling of Abraham. And this is the beginning of what we are going to call God's solution. All right? So again, where we left off with the fall was, what is the problem with the world? What's wrong? Humanity. Humanity's fall. Humanity's missing of the mark. That's what's wrong with the world. And that is what needs to be fixed if the original intention of the Creator is ever going to be restored and reestablished. And so, and this is the cool part about the Judeo-Christian tradition, in God's hands, anthropomorphism, in God's hands, the problem is going to become the solution. That is, what is the problem? Humans. How is God going to fix this problem? By using humans. God is going to fix the problem, solve the problem, provide a solution to the problem with the problem itself. Ooh. So, let's talk about one of the primary modes where God works this out. That is covenant. Now, covenant. It's not a word we use too often, but we all kind of have a sense of what it means. And covenant is a very common concept in the ancient world. It really still persists today, as we'll talk about. But it's very common in the ancient world, especially in the ancient Near East. That's what A-N-E means, ancient Near East. So ancient Near East is Egypt, Palestine, Babylon, Syria, getting into Persia, stuff that's not quite the East, you know, India and China and such, but is kind of in that little place between the rest of the Mediterranean and sort of the Europeans and then the Far East. So a covenant, first of all, is not a contract. It's similar to a contract. And a contract can help us understand what a covenant is. But a covenant is not a contract, okay? A covenant is not an economic exchange of goods. It's not an agreement. It's not like what you do when you say buy a car or a house. And we can tell this because if I said to you, yeah, I just bought a car, I made a covenant with Toyota, you'd be like, that's a really weird way to put it. And so we kind of sense, whether it's because of culture or maybe just the felicity of the word itself, we sense that covenant means something a little bit more sacred than just an average contract. This is not a contract. It's not a rental agreement. This is not an agreement to pay off a car. This isn't an agreement to for a phone service or something like that. There's something deeper, more resonant with the human soul and reality than just your average contract. And so, while like a contract, covenants are in the ancient world legally binding in that you could be punished by the government or by the progenitor and giver of the covenant, it is more of a kind of communal social reality than a modern conception of contract, or even sometimes the way we use covenants. So it's more than just an agreement. It's agreements that bear the honor of each party in its agreement, right? So if the covenant is not kept, it's more than just you are facing some sort of monetary or quantitative punishment. There's a qualitative punishment. You have failed to keep honor. So infidelity in a marriage, I think it's technically illegal, but I think that's mostly for like civil law issues and stuff like that. But it's more than that. Infidelity in a marriage, when someone cheats on their spouse, this is more than just not keeping the contract of marriage. There's something deeper here that has been committed than just failure to make a payment, right? It's more than just not making good on certain lines in the fine print. And so there's often with covenants a sort of ritualistic or religious significance. So even in the ancient world, when they're making covenants like marriage or like certain kinds of agreement about property or stewarding of property, if a lord, they wouldn't use the word lord, of course, but to think more kind of in somewhat modern and medieval terms, like if a lord or king makes a covenant with a servant or a member of that nation or community, there is, even if it's not about religious stuff, there is a religious sort of texture to it. There is something religious about that agreement. That is that honor aspect. If you break this covenant, you're not just breaking a law or a rule, you are offending the moral meaning of the universe. And so that we can still see this in a lot of marriage in the West. Well, in all cultures, many cultures. I think most cultures, it's safe to say, have a kind of religious aspect to a marriage. That there's something that we're calling upon the celestial uh, enliveners of the universe to bear witness to this event, not just the community. And covenants then are made most of the time, almost always, with the expectation that they wouldn't end. So it's difficult, as we've been talking about, to completely define a covenant. Oh, sorry about that. But the basic idea is that it's not just a contract. It's a bond. It's an oath. It's a vow. It's a solemn pledge. It's all these things with contractual aspects. And the reason we have this word covenant is because it's all these things, but it's not any single one of those things. It draws them all up together. And so, like a marriage. And so this is bound up in in the Hebrew understanding with this word chesed. All right, chesed is this extraordinarily difficult term to define. It's foundational to the Hebrew understanding of what covenant is. So chesed, it properly means love, but it's not a romantic love. It's not like I love pizza, I love my dog, I love that movie. It's not even foundationally emotive, although it can have emotive aspects. And so it's really hard to translate. If you speak another language or something, you know there's some concepts in other languages that just don't translate well into another language. I think Mitchell, I believe, in one of his discussion board comments made that statement about the Bible. And that there's a truth to that. And so chesed is one of these terms. And so it's usually translated as covenant faithfulness, or a lot of times you'll see like steadfast love or steadfast loving kindness. In the Psalms, this word is used all the time. You know, God has this loving kindness. And it's kind of a bond and loyalty and fidelity to the covenant that's so strong that we can only characterize it in words like love, which are, which is, I mean, I think anybody would agree, foundational to the human experience, and one of the deepest things, if not the deepest, I would say the deepest thing humans do, is love. And so that's what the bounding of the covenant is sort of orbiting through, is this chesed, this love of fidelity and loyalty. Covenants can be conditional or unconditional. Sometimes, and so in the Bible, covenant is always something that God makes with humans, and humans sort of agree to it. God is always the initiator of covenants. We do not initiate covenants with God. God initiates covenants with us. And so God, when initiating them, can be conditional or unconditional. So, the Noahic covenant of I shall never destroy with a flood again, that is unconditional. God said, I'm not going to do this ever, and that's the way it's going to be. Whereas there can be conditional covenants where if you don't do these things, which is the law, like the Ten Commandments, if you don't do these things, you will incur punishment, and I will not necessarily keep my covenantal agreement with you. Now, as covenantal theology works itself out in the Jewish mind, this kind of morphs, but that's the basic idea of a conditional covenant. But it's always entered in freely, and even though God is always the initiator, God doesn't have to do it. It's not something God has a necessity that forces God to do. God makes covenants freely, and then humans enter into them freely. And this is the real genesis of Genesis. It's the first covenant that begins to address the fall in the cosmic contours of salvation history. That is, it is the covenant where God begins to work out God's solution to the fall. And so, as we talked about, the creation and fall narrative is only Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 12 and forward is all about the beginning of Israel. And Israel's self-understanding is that they are based in their identity, in their establishment as a reality at all, covenantally with God. So covenant theology is a kind of hermeneutical framework or organizing principle through which we can understand the Bible. Not all traditions like covenant theology. I do. Obviously, and there's a lot of iterations of it though, and so I'm going to use the way I understand it and in the way that I agree when people are working it out. And so it really is though this kind of organizing principle. The Bible is read through a covenantal lens. It's read through God's freely willed activity to break into history and set terms of activity that will accomplish God's ends, the main end being the restoration of the fallen creation to its original, pristine, and rightful intentional state. And so God's covenants with humanity shape how we understand God, creation, and ourselves. What God covenants, both in each particular covenant and the fact that God covenants, that God does covenanting, helps us understand the kind of God that God is, the kind of creation that we're living in, and the kind of beings we are, getting at that who are we question and where did we come from question. And then, of course, what do we do question. And so then God's covenants shape how the biblical story unfolds. You could see, I mean, these acts are not like one-to-one correlations with covenants, but you can see how there's this covenantal reality is sort of a driving principle or conceptual structure for the biblical narrative itself. There are 7 major covenants in Scripture. Some people have different lists, and this is the list I'm going to use. The first one is the Adamic, that is with reference to Adam, or the first humans. God makes a covenant with them by creating them, essentially. That I've created you for these purposes. This is an initial agreement. And it has to do with the stewardship of creation and the giving of the image. There is the Noah covenant, which is the, I won't destroy the world with a flood again, so good thing we got that. There's the Abrahamic covenant, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. And then lecture after that, the Mosaic covenant, which has to do with the law and Exodus and the Passover, and sort of the kind of stealing of Israel's identity as the chosen people of God. There's the priestly covenant, which is God's covenant to continue to forgive and support Israel through its sacraments of sacrifice and temple worship and such like that. And then there's the Davidic covenant. This is key. This is super important to Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's the covenant that God says, I'm going to, from your line, David, and we're going to talk about all these, by the way. From your line, David, I am going to bring forth a chosen person, a Mashiach, a Messiah, an anointed one, who will culminate my purposes for not only Israel's, but in hindsight we know, for the world's history, for the entire history of humanity. And when I do, that culmination will have no end. Now, here's where it breaks from the Judeo-Christian tradition into the actual Christian tradition. Because Christians believe that Jesus Christ was this Messiah, and thus in Jesus a new covenant has been established that is going to bring history to its final culmination in the restoration of creation. Now, there are differing views among Christians and Christian traditions of where that leaves these previous covenants and really the essential binding covenants that are found in the Adamic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, priestly, and Davidic covenants. Because all these covenants are active for Jews. They're saying, no, these covenants they're still there. They haven't changed. They haven't ended. And so some Christians say by the founding of the new covenant in Jesus, God has abolished all those other covenants and they're now null and void, and Jews can think about them if they want, but they're not really there. They're gone. They're just, Jesus was the end to that. I don't personally hold to that, and this my tradition teaches. I'm Roman Catholic. My tradition teaches that the covenants that God makes are binding forever, and God knows that when God makes them, and that's what it means for God to make a covenant. Because when God makes a covenant, God doesn't end covenants. Now, we still believe that all of the Christians, that is, all of these other covenants are culminated in Jesus, but it doesn't provide a condition of nullity to the previous 7 or 6 covenants that we're talking about. They're still in play. And in that sense, Israel, like the church, is still the chosen people of God. And God still has a special and unique relationship with Israel that continues to this day. Now again, not all Christian traditions agree with this, but this is what the Roman Catholic Church teaches, that and in fact, we talk about the Jewish religion in Israel as our older brother. We understand that we are we are the effect of a previous activity that God has had with humanity in God's chosen people of Israel. So that these covenants are still in play and active, and that there is a sense in which the Jewish religion is just not a voided religion. It's still a active religion. Christians can believe that the Christ being the Messiah supersedes it somehow, but to say that Jewish religion is just now like moot is really, I think, a bad theology that doesn't respect the deepness of the Hebrew tradition and the covenantal tradition that God has forged with the people of Israel. So that, I think, gets us kind of good setup for how we're going to tackle the actual history of Israel from the biblical narrative, and should give us a good framework to keep kind of sussing out what this biblical story is. And so we're now going to turn to the Abrahamic covenant, which is really in some ways the way this whole thing starts, the beginning of God's solution. See you then.